Cawthon, and I'm the director of the Economic Opportunity Program here at Demos. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to Demos and to tonight's event. So for those of you who are not familiar with the organization, we are a multi-issue, nonpartisan policy research and advocacy organization. And even though we are headquartered here in New York City, our work is national in scope. And we focus on pursue four overarching goals, the first of which is a more equitable economy and broadly shared prosperity, a vibrant and inclusive democracy with high levels of civic engagement, an empowered public sector that works for the common good, and responsible U.S. engagement in an increasingly interdependent world. Tonight's event, I'm very excited about this. It focuses on a very inspiring new book by sociologist Lisa Dodson. It's called The Moral Underground: How Ordinary Americans Subvert an Unfair Economy. And now would be a good time for me to let you know that this handy copy of the American Prospect that you have on your chair has a nice excerpt from the book. We are co-sponsoring this event with the New Press, and we have Diane Wachtel here from the New Press, and also A Better Balance. Sherry, help me with your name here. Lee Wan. Okay. So thank you very much for working with us to make this event possible. I want to tell you a little bit about why what is in this book is so important to us here at Demos. The book really starts with some of the harsh realities of our economy that began long before the current recession. As we all know, if we look over the past 30 years, what we see is a serious decline in economic opportunity and economic security, and a growing and alarming proportion of our population is financially precarious. So that's because of everything from declining and stagnant wages, the growth of the low-wage job sector, the instability of those jobs, the fact that so many of those jobs don't provide traditional employer-sponsored benefits like health insurance and pensions, and even the companies that used to, many of them are not providing those benefits anymore. And as a result, in addition to low wages, families, young adults coming out of school, accumulating large amounts of debt in the form of student loans, credit card debt. And so not only do families not have the same routes to opportunity that they used to have, but they're then saddled with debt that then makes it harder and harder for them to get ahead. So part of what we do here at Demos in the Economic Opportunity Program is we examine the underlying systemic causes of all of this, and we do research on how it affects the lives of families and young adults who are just struggling to get along in the world, and the effects on children. And we try to promote public policy solutions that address those structural causes. But in the meantime, on a day-to-day basis, millions of struggling Americans are living their day-to-day lives, trying to get through, and it's all fine and good that we're working for policy solutions that one day may change the situation. But in terms of those day-to-day lives, we know an awful lot about what those lives look like, how the working poor cope, how families cope, the resilience of children in those families, the results of the failure to cope. But too often we talk about low-income people in isolation, totally outside the context of the social relations of their day-to-day lives. We talk about categories of social class: the working poor, the middle class, the professional class, And too often we reify these categories. I mean, they're helpful. We can make some useful generalizations. But I think one of the wonderful things about Lisa Dodson's book is it gets past those generalizations and highlights some of these interesting realities that are obscured. Another thing I think is really important about this book is it reminds us about the importance of resistance, and not only individual acts of resistance, but ultimately the collective importance of those individual acts. So I know you're all eager for me to stop talking and to hear from Lisa Dodson, but first I just want to tell you a couple of logistical things. Lisa's going to present for 20 minutes to half an hour. It's really important to her and to us. We have plenty of time to engage in a dialogue afterwards, so we'll have about at least half an hour for Q&A. I would ask you that during the question and answer period, please wait until someone comes and brings you a microphone, because we are recording this and webcasting this, and so that's important for that purpose. And once the event is formally over, we will continue our reception out there, and Lisa's book will be for sale. So I would like to turn it over to Diane Wachtel, the Executive Director of the New Press.
Thank you so much. Hello, I'm Diane Wachtel, the Executive Director of the New Press, and we're so thrilled to be here tonight. And we are so proud to be publishing Lisa Dodson's Moral Underground. It is a beautiful, beautiful book, and I commend it to each of you. The New Press, as you may know, as I hope you know, is the country's leading public interest book publisher. That means that we publish books for reasons having to do with the cultural and intellectual bottom line, and not necessarily the financial bottom line, but because the arguments that they make and the stories they tell are important for our national dialogue. And we try to do the things that the big commercial presses don't want to do and the small presses can't do, but that all of us must read in order to understand our society. Lisa Dodson's beautiful book I think of as the quintessential New Press book. It deals with such an important topic, the working poor. It comes at it from a completely unique perspective, the perspective of middle-class professionals who, when they suddenly understand what the lives of the working poor are like, start to subvert the system that they formerly upheld, start to bend the rules and break the rules and circumvent the rules in order to achieve that kind of fundamental decency that President Obama was talking about last night in his speech. The book is off to a rip-roaring start. Lisa has been touring. Lisa has been doing radio. She was on Grit TV this morning. I hope you can tune in to Marketplace on NPR this weekend. Her show will air, the show that she taped will air on Sunday. The reviews are starting to come in. You'll see on the back of the book, Robert Coles, the famous Harvard psychiatrist, called the book "The Documentary Tradition at its Very Best." The book is 8 years in the making. Publishers Weekly has already raved about it. They said Dodson's study is gripping and her argument is persuasive. We should not have to put compassionate Americans in a position where they have to choose between following rules and helping those who are trying to help themselves. It has been an utter pleasure to work with Lisa on this book. One of the things that the New Press does, in addition to working with very talented authors, is work with wonderful other not-for-profits. And we're very grateful to Demos for co-hosting tonight. Thank you in particular to Ginny, who put this event together. And thank you to Sherry and A Better Balance for co-sponsoring with us. We think that one of the things that the New Press does that is unique around our books is try to use them to affect social change. We're a 501c3, and we are interested in changing the world, and we do it via our beautiful books. If there's anyone in the room who is in a position to review this book, to excerpt it in a newsletter somewhere, to send a PDF out to a listserv, to let the world know. Once you hear Lisa speak, you'll appreciate how important this book is, and I'd love any ideas you may have. We have a sign-up list in the back also. If you'd like to leave your email, we'll let you know about future events involving Lisa and other New Press titles. So Lisa is currently a sociologist at Boston College. She's had a just fantastically interesting career. She's been a labor organizer and an obstetrical nurse, and it's going to be a real treat to hear from her tonight. I give you Lisa Dodson.
Thank you, Diane. I just want to add my thanks to Demos as well for hosting this event and hosting the idea of a moral underground. And I also want to really thank Sherry as well, Sherry Lewant. Sherry's work has been extremely important, better balance, dealing with a lot of the issues that we touch upon in the book. And I also have to say, Diane has just been an absolutely wonderful editor, understood, grasped, and really worked with me on this the whole time. So really a lot of credit there. And then I want to recognize a couple of people in the audience this evening because they were in on this book in a different kind of way. And one of those is Ellen Bravo, who Ellen was the director of 9 to 5, the National Association of Working Women, when this research first began, and I kind of feel like we were linking arms, and she was helping me break in some doors, and it was wonderful to work with Ellen. And then I also want to recognize Janice Dabney. Janice is from the Educational and Training Fund of 1199 SEIU, and also brought some people who actually work in some of the places that I did some of this research. So I welcome you and thank you for your help along the way. You don't do this kind of work unless people really help open the door for you and give you some time and also lend you a little bit of their trustworthiness. People aren't going to talk to you about the kinds of matters that they were good enough to talk to me about in this book unless they think that you're trustworthy. And so I thank you both. You know, when I first started out on what turned out to be a very long path, quite a number of years, I hadn't actually thought it was going to be as many as it turned out to be, but about 4 years along the way, so in about maybe 2004, 2005, I felt like I could see a pretty important story emerging in this work that I was doing, going out and talking to people. And it just seemed like a counterintuitive story in a lot of ways. It wasn't the story that you were generally hearing at that time. It wasn't about the joys of consumerism, and it wasn't all about self-interest. And that's what we were hearing the most about. That was certainly the national dialogue. So when I started to put this together, and I circulated a little, and I was advised that from a public policy perspective, and even from a publishing perspective, no one was really going to be interested in this account from the middle or an account from below, a people's analysis of the economy, a version that was really rooted in working class and also middle-income people's lives. It wasn't really the meat of public policy. That was one phrase, and the knowledge that comes from this kind of lives was not necessarily seen as possible to be part of a national dialogue. And things, of course, have changed a great deal over that time. And the idea now the idea that the economy is harms people and that even that it's failed is common. It's just common parlance. We hear about it all the time. Even the idea that there might be an issue of morality. The word moral or immoral may be part of how we look at the absolute reign of the market, the absolute dominance of the market in our lives. That's now actually fairly common, but I think all of us here can remember just a little while ago, that really seemed something of a voice in the wilderness, that kind of argument. I think of those in some ways as a kind of deep freeze of the Bush war years. But you know, just as chilling they were the years of the market knowing best. The market knew best about everything, and that the market culture was the American culture. That's who we were. That's how we were known. The market gains were all that mattered. And, you know, I always have to bring this up, but that was during that decade when we kept, in this country, the minimum wage was $5.15 an hour, you know, for almost a decade, while the wealth was ballooning at the top. It's gone up now, but it's still a very low wage, and part of that is how low it was kept for so long. Around 2009, I really started to walk away from, 2008 actually, I really started to walk away from doing the work out and talking to people directly. And by then, I had several hundreds of interviews with parents who were working hard, working full-time, and living poor, and raising their children. And above all, trying to keep their families intact. Number one, trying to keep your families intact. And that's really where this work started. But along the way, I was also talking with more and more middle-class people, and particularly middle-income people who work alongside low-income people every day, work alongside low-income parents and children and families in roles like job supervisors, employers, managers, but also in roles like teachers, working with low-income children in childcare settings of all kinds, and also healthcare providers. These were middle-class people whose everyday work, brings them into intimate knowledge, everyday intimate knowledge, and also they hold some authority in the lives of low-income people. If you think about that, they are bosses, they're teachers, they're principals in school. They hold some authority in the everyday lives of low-income people. And in their capacity, they go to what I think of as the nation's class crossroads. It's these main institutions, school, work, healthcare, main institutions where we look at each other across classes. These class borderlines is really where this book took root. It took root right there at that intersection. That became the heart of the story. Because what kept coming up during all that time, during the years when talk about a harmful economy was not public talk, when that was frozen and really stymied from the top, down there in the middle, this was being talked about all the time. I mean, people were talking about this every day. They were talking about a harmful economy, and they were coming face to face. They were coming face to face with their common lives, what they share in their common lives, the values they shared with what this economy is doing. And some recognized what I think of now as an economic fault line. It's this economic fault line that runs through all of our typical American institutions and spaces, workplaces, schools, healthcare. On one side of this line are people who are working hard, they're doing their jobs, and they're raising their families, and they're making enough money to get by. Some are doing very well, some are getting by. But every day they're looking into the faces of others who are also working just as hard in jobs that are just as important, and they don't make near enough to take care of their families. They don't make near enough. They are always behind. And so what I kept hearing from people, from a lot of different people in the middle who see this, was that it's just deeply unfair. It was just unfair. That was the talk during those years when we heard nothing about this as part of our national debate. And we also know that there are national polls that make this argument too. There have been many polls over the years. People think that those who are working should make a sustainable wage. They shouldn't have to wait for handouts. They shouldn't have to rationalize and explain their needs. If they're working the jobs of the nation, they should make enough money. But I also found out that a lot of people thought that working parents should be able to take care of their children and their families. That issue was a standout issue. In a time when the media and the government and the corporate faces of the nation said things that were things were booming, things were blossoming, a lot of money was being made, there were already a lot of people who work along that economic fault line who saw the world very differently. Not everybody. I don't mean to make that argument at all, but a lot of people saw it very differently. And some told me that sometimes at that economic fault line, when you look at it and you see people every day, it also becomes a moral line. It becomes a moral line. You're looking into the face of the harm that the economy is doing, and sometimes you have to decide what side of it you're on. And it turned out that watching this harm experienced by millions of working families provoked what I've come to see as acts of economic disobedience. It provoked people to disobey, but particularly not civil disobedience in a kind of traditional sense. It was explicitly about the economy. It was acts of economic disobedience. I met some grocery store bosses who thought that to send a man home at the end of a long week of work with less pay than he can buy food for his family is wrong. And maybe it is a bigger wrong than siphoning off some groceries and putting them in a bag and sending those home with him. It was a wage supplement, but it's also a disobedient act. It's clearly that. And I met doctors who thought that only treating a child in a family, because the health insurance program is for children, it's a child health program, so you only treat the child in the family when you see that her mother has strep too, that's wrong. And it is a worse wrong than not writing up a script for her, writing up a second script for a second child in the family who happens to be a 25-year-old mother. There were restaurant managers who thought that letting low-wage workers who could no way pay for childcare, letting them come up with a work plan of their own, a work schedule that suited the needs of their children and family, that covered the work, too, you can do both, that suited the needs of the family first, covered the work, that was a better wrong, or maybe it was even a right. Maybe it was even should be talked about as a right. These were small acts against rules that ignored the family impact of inadequate wages. I met teachers who let children use their home addresses so that they would not lose access to the school, because you know access to a school is based on your residence. And if your parent has lost his job or your family cannot make the rent, you move, and you move again in many cases. And so I met teachers who said, you can use my postbox, you can use my address. And I met school nurses who found ways to get pharmaceutical companies to what they called donate a lot of additional asthma inhalants for children who were only given one, because that's what the health program did, just one. And you know, children lose things. One is not enough. They bent the rules. Some might call it stealing. They said they were bending the rules so kids could breathe better. And I met principals who specialized in making sure that special needs included children who needed some one-on-one attention, not because they were hyperactive, but because they had become hypervigilant in a world in which their parents couldn't protect them because they didn't have the wages to provide them with a kind of security and safety that every child demands. And so these principals found ways of calling special needs the needs of a child who was not being treated right in her society. And I met, by the way, not everybody made it into this book. Some people asked that their names and their stories not be put in this book. But I met some truck drivers. I thought of that because they explicitly said that they were not to go in the book, whose oil trucks made some unscheduled stops at elderly people's houses whose $200 voucher, fuel voucher, had run out by the end of December, and it was mid-January. And they surmised that that petroleum company was going to do okay, but that those elderly people in mid-January were not. So they made some unscheduled stops, and they had some fancy ways of calculating what was in that truck. That much I was allowed to tell you. That was approved. I had a lot of negotiations. You know, I want to say that not for one moment should we think that these acts of economic disobedience can tilt things back. They can't do that, of course not. They can't make things okay for these families, but they still matter a lot. They matter a lot. These are individual gestures of very ordinary people from all around the country, of all different kinds of background. These are gestures of ordinary people who spoke about deep unfairness and a willingness to take risks because of what they were seeing down in the middle of the country, regardless of what was being talked about on top. They know from below what we know from national data. The national data tell us that 25% of the nation's children, 1 in 4, is on food stamps at any one time. 1 out of 4, maybe as many as 50% over the course of their lifetimes. Now, you have to remember that in order to get food stamps, you have to be good and poor. You have to have nothing in your pocket to be eligible for food stamps. That's what these people know up front, face to face. They saw it. We also know today that somewhere around 28 million jobs pay less than $10 an hour. Some more than 40 million pay less than $12 an hour. And that's the reason why these children are facing what they are. If you add that up, it means that millions of families are pulled between paying to eat or heat. That is what they're facing. So these individual acts can't possibly make up for this structural shift that is needed, but they are very important and they are largely underground. They're not part of a public talk. I'm not the only person noting them now. There was a story last month about a woman named Jackie Ramos. She worked in a bank. She happened to work at the Bank of America, in fact, and she decided that she couldn't go along with the rules. And so she said, I help people get on programs because of their credit or the loans that they had. I help them get on programs they didn't qualify for, but they definitely needed. It cost her job. But I think what is really important is that it made national news. Now, it wasn't front page news, it was tucked in back a little bit, but it made national news because the meaning of this is not lost upon people. I believe that the meaning of this is not lost upon people. I found in going out, taking this book out, doing radio shows, getting call-ins, and I thought a lot of stuff was going to be lobbed at me when I started to talk about this stuff. I really did, but I have been really surprised at the way people get it, at the way people call up and say that they get it, call up and say that they participate in these same kind of activities. I mean, sometimes over live radio, descriptions I've heard since I've started. A lot of people know that it gets much more complicated, and maybe sometimes what's criminal is not breaking the rule. Maybe sometimes it's criminal not to. This, however, runs, I think, really counter the kind of right-wing version of how we know ordinary Americans in this country. This is not the Palin-esque, version. This is not the Tea Party character of who we are, which I think has gotten just a whole lot of traction, and I really feel we need to speak back to in all kinds of ways. I did meet a few people like that, but much more often than that, I encountered this other part of the American character, and it really contests that right-wing self-interest only. But it really shouldn't surprise us because it's really as old as history. We know this here, that the greater the injustice and the inequality, an underground will emerge. It will emerge in response. I sometimes feel it's almost as though we've forgotten that history or we've been almost browbeaten into disbelieving it. But we right now have tens of millions of working people who make nowhere near a sustainable income, and we have a new wave that have lost their jobs, and they can't take care of their families, and they object to that. They do object to it, and they're looking for economic justice, and they will get engaged. We also have millions of other people who do manage to get by, but who line themselves up with the value of a just society, and that includes just pay. So thank you very much. So I just want to say that I know there are a lot of people in this room who've done a lot of work on these issues and thought a lot about them, and I didn't want this only to be a monologue, so I'm really happy to open this up to questions, but also to conversation. Yes.
So in your book, do you deal with the issue of undocumented workers and the exploitation of undocumented workers?
I have a passage in the book, discussion specifically. I mean, it came up in lots of small ways. Here and there, people make references, some of them inclusive of undocumented people, some of them excluding. But there's a piece in the book I have that took place in a town in the Southwest, and it's a town that is a town where people from Mexico come into the American part of the town all the time and use services. And that's really where I engage a bit of a dialogue with people, how people reacted to it. There was an effort in that town, this has been true for many, many generations, that this town, people go back and forth. Families are back and forth. There was an effort at one point in that town to close the schools so that children who had been born in America but actually lived across the border couldn't use the schools anymore. And the whole town got together and said, no, we're not doing that. So that's really the place in the book where I found that conversation was pointedly discussed.
In addition to the income side, there's the outgo side. When companies charge much more than they really have to, for example, the oil rise in price deprived a lot of people of maybe 20% or 30% of their after-tax money because of the price of oil going up. And this happens in so many ways where employers cut back on overtime, they don't pay for overtime, and so on.
That's right.
So there's something to be said on that side, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hi, this is more a comment, and anyone that's been following this story in the New York Times, and I guess it's the style pages, the chic style of having your house or apartment cold.
Yeah.
That
I
this
saw
is
that.
this is a a cultural thing about keeping your
Yeah.
home at 40 degrees and
Yeah.
how brisk and healthy it is. And I just note that today the letters to the editor talked, a number of people wrote in saying, come on, people are worried about keeping their children warm,
Yeah.
their home warm. This is taking culture, to the absurd, and saying, like if we go naked, will that be the new culture?
Yeah.
Because we
And
can't
trivializing, making
trivializing and
the reason so
making
many people
it hip
are cold.
or cultural. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a reaction to the downturn in the economy.
Yeah.
I thought
Yeah.
it's kind of tied in some
Yeah,
ways.
absolutely. Yeah.
Did you trip over any governmental or institutional barriers that made it difficult? And I will give you, for example, something that affected our family. We hired home health aides to care for a bedridden parent at home as an independent contractor, and paid them independent contractor. We paid $15 an hour with the understanding that they would pay their taxes. In the state of New Jersey, this is not allowed. Home health aides cannot work as independent contractors, and the householder, in this case an elderly householder, was penalized for having paid his helpers this way. Within this is a situation where quality people were very available independently. They would not work through the agencies because they weren't paid enough to be able to serve well. The state thinks households should follow the same employment rules that IBM follows with all of their human resource people. It's not something they can do easily. So here is an institutional barrier if you happen to get caught. When we looked to see if anyone had any information about how to resolve the situation, no one in the field of all the Alzheimer's people, everybody who needed home health aides, no one had tripped over this as a problem. Did you trip over an institutional barrier of this sort in your work?
Well, I think I'd like to actually pass this maybe to Pearl or to people here who actually are much.
So, I mean, I a little personal experience and then institutional experience, but what has operational is that, there is a limit to what Medicare will pay for. And then beyond that, you can contract for licensed personnel, which if you're paying for it yourself and you're in middle income, then you can't afford it because there is the VIG attached by the agencies to, so if a licensed CNA might receive, $15 an hour or $12 an hour, but the agency they work for is getting 25. So people, migrate to this kind of underground, independent contractors, and some are totally independent, and then there are people who really act as agents, and they collect their own VIG from the people. But I think it goes on countless times.
I just add that the home care providers, the system is that home care workers earn very little, and some private agencies earn very, 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 very much. And there is no balance in the distribution, and it's by and large public money. And it's a challenge as unionized workers to get those people who do that very specific, responsible job fair pay. But also in those states where the state laws have changed, for example, in Massachusetts, where the state allows family members or loved ones to care for others and be paid as the caretaker, which is a really wonderful, wonderful system. I don't know how the taxes work on that.
I had a question, but also just a comment on that. I've worked in taxes for 20 years, and the whole thing is when you have a voluntary compliance system, which is really what we have with the IRS, people have to self-regulate, and the way they've done it is they've moved in the direction of requiring forms on anything they can. So there's very few people now who really make decisions on which taxes they're going to pay, which is really what self-employed individuals do. So their trend has been to eliminate as much as possible self-employed people because that requires voluntary compliance. And many self-employed people, in fact, don't have the wherewithal to kind of calculate their taxes and they pay double Social Security on their net income because they have to pay both the employer portion and their portion. So, it's a hard thing because you're getting the tax system interfering, but my question was really on this whole thing of cash versus, because cash can be considered, if you pay someone in cash, right, it could be considered a form of, you can justify why you're paying less money because you figure the person may or may not pay taxes. So it can be a form, you can feel morally justified in that you're helping the person make more money and, you don't have to deal with the tax situation. But the piece that concerns me so I was thinking of that, but the piece that concerns me is if people are doing this as opposed to fighting the system, you can justify your moral action. My Lai, we justify, they couldn't shoot. But so it's morally justified, but what happens is it doesn't lead, I'm not sure how it leads to change in the system because people are channeling that defiance in their action individually rather than taking on the group.
Yeah,
so that's
I think it's a really key point. Ellen, did you want to say something to that point? I'm sorry.
This is exactly, I think, Lisa's book ends with an agenda of new rules that need to be, and interesting thing is how to tap into those folks, because the groups, those of us who are working on these, like something like paid sick days, for example, we can find business owners who will speak out. I do this, I think it's the right thing to do, and I want a level playing field. And obviously we can find workers who tell their stories. But to find the sympathetic in the middle, and because they don't have any organized way to, and we need to speak to that. For example, there's a group called Domestic Workers United, I hope you all know them, and Direct Care Alliance, and both of these groups are organizing care workers and domestics and nannies to change the rules and say you can't be excluded from minimum wage and you have the right to unionize. And it's very exciting what's happening, and one of the things they're doing is working with employers who'll say, I want there to be rules, I don't want to violate them, I want to do the right thing, and I want there to be standards, and that's great. But this is a sort of different milieu, and I think part of our challenge is, I don't think, someone said, is this a prescription for, no, of course not. It's not what you're urging people to do it. It's acknowledging two things I think that are really important. One, there are people doing it, and I love what you just said about it challenges the teabagger view of who the average person in this country is. But the second thing is that it's also a challenge to us in the movement of what language to use to say to folks, there's another way you can change it.
Hi, it's related to this point, but it's sort of the larger question of, what makes a movement? So there are these individual, acts of random kindness, to put it in, very largely, but there's also sort of the movement, professional activists, nonprofits, and we know about all that, and the tensions and all that. But so it's partly, I think, two things. One is like, how do you really have real civic engagement, to put it in social science terms? And the other is what you were talking about, where you have these cross-class intersections at public institutions like schools or whatever public other spaces you have. So how do we create that kind of morality, civics education, etc., so that the rules have to change, because the status quo said African Americans have to sit elsewhere, or so how do you really change that, all that exists now? So I think that's where the challenges are, and I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I don't have all the answers to that at all. I mean, to me, the first thing I felt my sort of duty was, my piece of the work was, after I had come upon it and then come upon it and then come upon it and then decided I wanted to systematically really investigate and then raise it up, was to shine a light on this, and was to speak back to what I think has been a monopoly on describing who ordinary people in this country are. And that description makes us feel as though we can't organize, as though we can't look to the goodwill and alliances among people. So to me, that's part of it. Now, that doesn't answer then the next question is, how do we go about doing it? I want to say two things, though. One is that this is more than random acts of kindness. There's a lot of that out there. This is acts of disobedience. These are thought-out acts. When you talk to people who do this, these are some of the most ethical people who choose that. And a lot of their language was, I heard this so many times, I have to look myself in the mirror. I have to sleep at night. I put myself in her shoes. I put myself in his shoes. So these are important people. These are people who don't break rules easily, but it's precisely because they're beginning to look at the way the rules are complicit with a system that's just not fair. Now, I just recently was listening to someone, a new film, I think it is coming out that's looking at Freedom Summer and the Freedom Riders. And a point that he made, I believe his name is Nelson, a point that he made was that before it became what we knew was a really organized Freedom Riders, before it became an organized Underground Railroad, before we organized to get rid of Jim Crow laws, there were a whole lot of people in a whole lot of places who were beginning to say, this is just, I can't be with this, I can't walk with this, even if I'm not the person who's experiencing that. And my main point is to say that's going on right now. People are looking at this economy, and one issue that really stood out for me, because I began to ask not only the what you're doing, but why. Why would you do this? Because people are risking, in some cases, they're really taking risks. And the issue of unfair wages always came up, but more than that, I have to say, the issue that came up the most often was this issue of what I think of as care poverty. That people understand that how hard it is to take care of your family and your elderly and the people you love and the people to whom you're committed. And then they think, how would I do it if I was making, a tenth of my income, a 25% of my income? This issue that other people who are working hard can't take care of their own. That they literally cannot, because that's how things are. That seemed to be a place of real rebellion. That was sort of the moment. People used to say, a lot of people said things like, well, as a mother, or as a father, or as someone who has a sister who has kids. It's almost like they were naming themselves in ways to explain why they would make this, why they would step further, why they would almost claim kinship with these other people and say, she should be able to go home and take care of her children, or I'm going to pass on some food, or pad paychecks. I mean, one person said he pads paychecks. So what I'm saying is that I don't know the step from this sort of, I guess it's sometimes called pre-political, pre-mobilized, but I do know that you don't get to that next step unless we pay attention to the fact that there are a lot of people in this country, and they're not only the people who themselves are not being paid what they should be, economic injustice affects many of us, and a lot of people, I think, feel very strongly about it. How about this lady, and then we'll move back.
Yes, from listening to you, I was wondering what percentage of the people all around the country, because I would gather that you've been traveling all around the country for the past 8 years doing this research, and it seems like it's small pockets of people that are fighting against the system. Mm-hmm. So, I just wanted to know, like, an estimate of what percentage. Yeah. And what type of people, that are basically fighting back? Because I see, it seems to me like it's a fighting back against the system.
Yeah. I can't give that to you as a percentage, because the kind of research I do isn't something like a survey where I can get them all back and then say 40% we're doing this and 60% we're doing that. And the truth is that people are not going to answer these questions on a survey. They're not going to talk about these kinds of actions. You just can't get this information unless you pay a lot of attention, are seen as trustworthy, and spend time to get people. But what I will tell you is that everywhere I went, most people were saying that it is a profoundly unfair economy, and they don't like living in it, and it really intrudes into their lives. And then a small percentage were saying, and I'm going to break the rules. I think, you had your hand up quite a lot.
Well, it does sound like you have some extraordinary stories and very important insights into the economy and the individuals who play a role in it. My question is, did you get a sense of what their political and economic analysis was? That is, to be very concrete about it. Did they blame Wall Street? Did they blame Washington? Were they Republicans? Were they Democrats? Mm-hmm. Were they sympathetic to unions? Did they express any inclination to organized action?
Yeah.
Leftists, rightists?
Yeah. The kind of research I didn't ask people to declare themselves in those ways. I asked people, my questions are, what kind of work you doing? Walk me through your day. Where do you run into issues or problems, like with managers? What problems do you run into hiring and supervising low-income people? Walk me through that. Tell me why you think that's true. So I sort of accompany people into their lives, and I don't start out with this declare yourself as this, that, or the other thing. On the other hand, people did, and they do as they talk, will make some claims about how they affiliate themselves or where they place themselves. And I have to tell you that people were kind of all over the map. Generally, particularly towards the end, and you have to understand I was doing this during the years when people were not, talking about Wall Street, or other than saying, how great it is in general. But a lot of people would say that they thought that it was really unfair and that big business and a small group of people who own big business are getting away with murder, and that's why so that was a pretty common thing for people to say, yeah. I think actually, I think you've had your hand up the longest, and then we'll.
I think it would be interesting if you were so inclined to go back to a lot of the folks who participated and ask some pretty concrete questions. For example, would they support the Employee Free Choice Act? And that would be interesting to see if their kind of fundamental belief in the unfairness would then translate into some legislation or significant increases in the minimum wage, and then again on questions of health care. So
I can't even predict, it would seem obvious that given some of the things people said they believed and even did, that they would line up in certain ways, but I don't think that would necessarily match that well, and I think that's partly because we have not paid attention to how people frame their very strong moral stands, not only for themselves but for other people. We've let other people, I think, make those claims, family values claim, these are people who, the way I see this happening is sort of from ground up, having these conversations with these people begin to define how we would talk about those policies, rather than take those policies and say, okay, where do you line up on them? Because there's been so much out there that I think has distorted the meaning of so much of that, yeah. I think he's next.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sort of curious if you've looked at this question of how this has changed over time. So in other words, if we had done this study 20 years ago, would we find something different? Mm-hmm. And if it's something different, what's changed that's made people, sort of assert this moral mm-hmm. right to undermine the system?
I'm sure some of it would have been there. I mean, I don't really know. I think that some of this would have been around, particularly depending on what sort of workplaces you went to, what areas of the country you went to. But I think that there are two factors that have made it a little easier for people to make this claim. One is the degree to which the wage just does nowhere near represent a person's living, so how low the wage, and it's not just the minimum wage, it's all the wages right above the minimum wage, because as long as you keep the minimum wage down low, you keep all these other wages very low too. We're talking about tens of millions of families now. But I think another issue that really, and I'm still working on how to articulate it, but that really stood out was the idea that these people are working and they can't take care of their families. This issue of care, a kind of assault on the right to take care of the people you really love, seemed to really stir up a lot of people. And what I mean by that is that if you're working really hard at wages of $10 an hour, $9 an hour, you can't purchase childcare. We all know that. I mean, anyone has been involved in this, knows anything about childcare, anything about the system, you literally cannot buy your way out of pain with that kind of money, but you can't be home to do it. So I think the fact now that over the last 25 years, which is the period you talked about, that so many women are in the workplace as well as men, that people are everybody's working, and that there has been no real recognition of what that means for families. I think that that's an issue that we've not recognized how powerful, how potent that issue is, because middle-class people are struggling, and they're very disturbed by not being as involved with their kids' lives or worrying about their parents. They're very disturbed about it too, and this is a place of great alliance to me. So I think that's a difference. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think so many people use this term, well, as a parent, I couldn't do this thing. Well, as a dad, I couldn't do this thing, yeah.
it would seem to me that you were talking about the modern day Robin Hoods.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, in terms of this Robin Hood,
Yeah.
did they offer you alternative styles in terms of bartering, for instance, that you talked about the teacher and the certain, groups of middle class people? Did they offer alternatives to what they were doing in terms of just dissenting? Mm-hmm. Was it just that they did it out of the kindness of their heart, or was it just that they wanted something in return?
A lot of people talked about the fact that because this economy has become so unfair, so stratified, and that so many people, bottom 30, 40%, are struggling so much. A lot of people talked about how their job, these are middle class people now, said that their jobs just aren't what they wanted them to be. Being a teacher is not, am I a teacher, or am I someone trying to hold this child together and these children together? Should I pay attention to the fact that I know this child goes home every day and the house is empty? Is that my role? What's my role? Managers who said, I thought that I was, I like business, I like being an employer, but I thought that the jobs that I had were actually going to take care of a family. I don't like the idea that I have these people working this hard, and it doesn't take care of a family. It's not my idea of what I thought my job would be. A lot of people talked about how they were disappointed, and how, as doctors, nurses, I mean, you name it, everybody I interviewed talked about ways in which their job, even though they were making a living, making a living income, how their jobs had been distorted and made smaller or eroded in many ways because they were dealing with people who could not make a living. And so I don't even think most people would see themselves as dissenters. A few people did, but I think people were more likely to say something like, look, this is just the kind of guy I am. I can't, I am not going to dock his pay. And I don't care what the boss says. His dad is Alzheimer's. He's got to be out. I'm just not going to do it. And they didn't then make that, it wasn't all, these are pearls to me. They need to be linked together. They are wonderful moments. They are who we are, but we need to draw them together to make it more powerful. Yeah. I don't know if you were next. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it on? Yes. I work with the governments and the UN a lot. And don't these issues also I think is similar to Copenhagen or the environmental movement, bring up the need for a new consciousness, and what type of systems are we creating? And I remember years ago, I had, actually it was under Clinton, to be honest, I had proposed also to some of the UN and the lower wage Bangladesh ambassador, et cetera, that we need certain standards of for wage, minimum wage, and labor standards and health standards. And even if it's a two-tier system, it's better than this overly competitive mindset that's creating a downward spiral, supposedly in American interest, to get the cheapest possible goods. And our manufacturers, et cetera, will probably are supposed to get other better-paying technical jobs like Microsoft or whatever, which did well. But after a while, could these things also be considered, which actually in the overseas, it's creating a downward spiral, even slave labor and sexual slavery, exploitation of all kinds. And couldn't this also be considered a sort of a economic blowback to the Bush focus or doctrine of gross domestic product and marginalization of lower income people, as you're pointing out, and the need for better focuses, and what is it type of systems are we creating? And what does it say, even in a democracy, about ethical people, or frankly our religious state, which doesn't seem to make much sense either? Mm-hmm. And don't we need to create a different consciousness, more ethical, rational, humanistic behavior and systems to help facilitate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the ethics and the kind of moral discussion that was going on among these folks, the people I'm talking about, that's what I'd like to elevate and have really lead a lot of what our discussions are, because, I think we've seen where we've gotten to by not listening to people, not including people. So, yeah, big shift. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk about how power disparities and divisions are inscribed into these relationships between people. So I'm wondering how that shapes the actual relationships between the individuals involved in these transgressions, because the risk, I think, is that there becomes a certain paternalism or assumptions about or romanticization of poverty, or there could be all kinds of sort of ill consequences. And I wonder if there is also a kind of relationship, cross-class relationship building and bridging that has come, or people talk about that in the course of.
First of all, this is messy stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, this is people, first of all, I mean, the question I always would be saying to myself as I was reading these and kind of writing them up, well, of course, there's discretion involved. Who do you choose to do this for, and who do you not choose to do it for? I mean, this is messy stuff. This is a reaction to a situation that is just so stratified and unfair, but it's not a systematic reaction, And so I think that there's a potential for all kinds of things, that we could be concerned about. The other part of your question was I think what you were saying was, did it go both ways? Was there learning both ways? And not in all cases, by any means, but in some cases, I think the act of actually thinking what it must be like to be in this other person's life and shoes, and to deal with particularly trying to take care of your family and your children when you don't have any resources to do that, that often pushed people in a way, proximity, face-to-face, really struggling with somebody else's humanity. I think that does have enormous potential. But there's nothing neat about this. There are all kinds of risks, yeah.
I had a sense, I've only started the book, but it seems to me there's different kinds of opportunities.
Yeah.
So for teachers or nurses or doctors, they have groups where conversations like this could happen.
That's right.
And where there'll be recognition. You've done that, I've done that.
Yes.
And there's a little less, I'm probably a little more openness.
Yeah, there
it
is.
sounded like people like B and other people that you talked to had no idea they were going to tell you this.
Yeah.
Don't describe themselves that way in the world.
Right.
It just came out.
That's right.
And that they see it very much as an individual, I just couldn't help myself
That's right.
because I couldn't bear it anymore. And so how to structure a conversation for them,
Yes.
for getting them to see, and that's what, we wish your book would get lots of attention so that people would say, oh, wow, I could have been B. Or she didn't, I've never met Lisa Dodson, but I'm in there too. And maybe I'm not the only one who does this, and maybe it's more than my individual moral outrage that needs to
That's right.
act. So
That's right.
looking for opportunities to.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't want to introduce a cynical note, but with respect to the manager-employee relationship, those kind of like off-the-books favors of, taking food home, don't worry, go home, I'll punch you out, while they're, they may have a good end or maybe even some good intent. It's also in an employment relationship used as a way to control and try to use loyalty as a tool when the job itself doesn't produce the kind of relationship of that an employee would go the extra mile. So you let them punch out, you let them take food home, you look the other way.
Yep.
But then you say, hey, remember,
Yep.
I looked the other way. And in terms of the EFCA question, people who do those kind of acts, very much, they're in a position of control. And so they may think it's great for them to give the people an hour off because, that helps them with their paycheck. But if a union, the idea of a union or the employees saying, hey, we collectively want an hour off, that many times the reaction is, well, that's fair and that's what I'd like. It's like, oh, no way, I'm not going to be able to do that. I can't run this place. So
Yeah. These moments don't change that relationship. Absolutely not. No. Yeah.
Well, let me follow what you say. I know many teachers, they are socialist thinking, but they have to play within the rules. Because I know many of them, they put them in the bumper room once they miss, out the guideline, because the system built a certain way. If you have a family to taking care of you, think it's not right, but you have to follow the rules. And I see there was down my block, there was a school next to the men's school. Then I found out it was the bumper room where they put, the teacher that been disciplined. If you not follow the rule of the Board of Ed, and you consider yourself a bad guy, they put you in a room, So this is why probably some of the folks that have conscience, but, because of the way the system built, and they worry about, their bread and butter, so they they know it's not right, but they have no choice,
I hope your book makes it on the Times bestseller list and you get on some of this national TV, because I think it's very, very worthwhile. But I think there's another part of this that we're not really getting across, in that a lot of these people who are being paid off the books because their bosses, which in this case are mostly women who are with acquiescent husbands, or they're single, they have upper middle class. They refuse to pay them on the books because they want to save the money. And these people just travel throughout their whole life on this cash basis or low basis. And when it comes time for 65, there's no Social Security for them. They're the permanent poor. That's part of the stratification that's happening in our society. And I think we have to get that out as a moral question also. Absolutely. And we are now talking, this was brought up in 1972. Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, proposed a sub-minimum wage. Gave Nixon $250,000 and so forth. President Bush talked about a sub-minimum wage for healthcare workers, in nursing homes and so forth. And now, it was in Business Week several months ago, about a sub-minimum wage so young people can get jobs. So, we're really on the cusp of being squeezed in all places. So if you can reach new moral ground, we just might be able to make some progress in our country.
Well, I think also, to me, again, nothing that came out of this, would shift the structural relationships in workplaces or an effort to institute a sub-minimum wage. Why? How about no wage? You could say it's just apprenticeship. We can go back to indenturehood. It does not address that, or it could not speak to that in the sense that it would change that. But the issue, again, the issue to me is that I think that part of what has stymied, I use the term browbeaten, I feel sometimes as though we have really found ourselves becoming mute. We don't sort of speak back to this very right-wing image of who we are as a whole people. We'll talk about the poor maybe, and then we'll also critique, as we should, what's going on top and the corporations. But there's a kind of silence to me, and that the possibility of mobilizing, I think people, the only possibility is if we believe that people actually are going to become in alliance with one another and care about these issues. And that's what came out in this. But it does not speak to the sort of those structural issues or policy issues that you're...
I want to respond to many people don't pay cash so that they can save money. It's not the money, it's the bookkeeping. Households cannot handle the bureaucratic bookkeeping and the reporting and all of the paperwork that you have to do and all the 29 little pieces of money and reports you have to send in order to put someone on the books. The bookkeeping is out of hand. It's the institutional barrier With an independent contractor, the bookkeeping is very simple, and it's easy to pay people enough so that they have enough to pay their double Social Security. I worked as an independent contractor for most of my professional life for the freedom of that, and also for the simple bookkeeping. There is another point that also comes up. It's in everyone's best interest if the people in the country earn enough to live on. They say our society is supported 70% consumer spending. If people don't make enough money to buy the things that they need to be marginally comfortable, nothing works. Society doesn't work. So we all have to make enough money to live because it holds the whole society together. That's why and how the middle class built in the first place, and having it shredded and disintegrating is bringing our entire economy to its feet.
I think there are two up here.
Two quick things. One, I think it might be interesting to set up a website where people could post their own stories and respond to what you brought up in the book. And the second thing is, I think it could be very telling and powerful to see more public responses to people who get caught. You mentioned at the outset, the story of the woman working for Bank of America who got caught. I mean, I think that could be very powerful to see what the public reaction is to these things happening. I'm wondering, did you have other examples of people that you met and worked with where maybe the public galvanized around someone who was doing something, one of these acts of economic disobedience?
I didn't talk to anybody who had gotten caught and fired, so that kind of public. But what I did, so it wasn't public. What there was also often a kind of conspiracy, like everyone knew that this person was doing this thing, and maybe you wouldn't because you were afraid to, but you would never acknowledge that you knew that this other person was, this manager or this teacher or this principal. So there was that sort of tacit I saw. But I didn't actually interview anyone who told me an account of having gotten caught. Jackie Ramos, who did get caught, got a lot of positive response. People wrote in and said, "Why shouldn't she do that?" She's doing what many of us would want to do if we were in a position to do it. Bank of America, belly of the beast. I think these people had their hands up.
Excuse me. There's a few things I wanted to say. I really enjoyed your talk, but having grown up very poor and living in city housing, I was very aware, and being a social worker, I'm still aware of how the larger society truly condescends to people of lower income, and that they have less morals and this and that. The education is abominable. I mean, there's so many issues. I totally agree with the person who said that I feel like the rich, the upper classes don't realize that. Why do we arm ourselves to the teeth? Because it's poverty. People are stealing to survive for the most part. And that we do need, like Ford built, gave enough money to buy his Edsel or whatever. But the other thing that I find morally reprehensible and makes my blood curdle is what is wrong with a society that can spend $7 million on a year because you happen to be born talented, so you can run with a ball, or you're a nice pretty boy who knows how to read the news, or we spend $56 million in this state to advertising campaign for a lottery that comes up with ads that exploit the poor. Fulfill your dreams, win the lottery. Sometimes I just go nuts. To me, that's another moral outrage. What is wrong with us? And I feel like there's too many people who don't understand how, the pull you up with your bootstraps is nice and easy. But when you grow up poor, you also get poor education. And try to get out of that. It's not easy. And now we're making, public education so much more difficult. It is a complex issue. And I totally agree with what you're saying. But I think that's another moral issue that I don't hear talked about enough.
so I've been thinking a little bit more about this because I was thinking of Kohlberg. I was thinking of the different moral theories, right? And the whole concept of empathy and showing empathy. And then the other thought I had was, cheating levels in schools are anywhere between 70 and 95%. Take it forever you want. And so, I, of course, I've been looking at cheating thinking, not such a good thing because, of course, people who cheat at schools then go on to cheat down the line. But in this case, we could say, that people, saw that, why are people cheating in schools? Because it's economically just, you needed to get ahead. And then they're taking that and applying it to moral, actions. Right, being conscious, because it's not, what you're talking about is not an unconscious act. You're talking about people who really are thinking
That's right.
at a deep level, should I do this or not? Is this right? It is an individual action, but the problem is all those individual actions shape the group culture. So I don't know, I just think it's very interesting what you're bringing out because it's showing cheating in a different way, that learned behavior, and it's saying it's okay for individuals to take action against authority when the authority is not acting, or the authority is acting immorally. So anyway, it's a very provocative book.
Yeah,
It's very
well,
good.
thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for coming. I appreciate it.
That's right. Thank you so much to Lisa. I also, on behalf of Demos, want to thank you all for coming. Thanks again to A Better Balance and the New Press for co-sponsoring this event. If you want to linger for additional conversation,